So welcome everyone to this webinar. It's the first time that we've done something like this, so bear with us. We're completely new to the technology and doing things in this way, but my name is Becky and I run, in the UK, I run development days, and for people that do the work with horses, so whether it's the therapy work, educational work, or the leadership and corporate work. And the most recent day that we ran was on the art of facilitation. And Sue very kindly offered to do a lunchtime piece for us about her recent PhD findings. Sue unfortunately couldn't make it on that day, so we realised that probably the best thing to do is actually set up a proper webinar and give her a whole hour to give us just a little snapshot of what, 3 years of studying?
Closer to 6.
Yeah. Okay, so 6 years of research into facilitation with horses. Sue's particular bias was leadership, but having seen Sue's findings, I've encouraged her to do the webinar tonight and make it open and available to everyone, because really the crossover is to all types of facilitation work with horses. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sue. She can do an introduction. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat box, and I'll either interrupt Sue and ask them if I feel like they're relevant, or we will save them to the end. Okay, sound good?
Thanks, Becky. That's really helpful. And I suppose what I wanted to say as well is that really tonight it's only we've only got an hour, and I suppose what I just want to do is give you an overview of the findings from the research and just gauge some interest, really, to see if there's any particular areas that are of particular interest. Would this be, would a series of webinars be helpful? So I suppose the purpose of tonight is to get that overview and to gauge that interest, really. So we're not going to try and cover a whole thesis in an hour, is what I kind of reassure you. And I suppose I just want to say a little bit more about who I am and why am I qualified to do this research, really. So can you all see that second slide? So hopefully Becky can just type in if, or it's just any doubt if you can't. So I'll carry on. Oh, brilliant! That's fantastic. So I suppose a couple of things really to pay attention to, really. So I'm an occupational psychologist. I've been working for over 20 years in leadership development in particular. But I've also done personal development. But that's my area of expertise, is particularly around leadership development, but not leadership development in too much in terms of it being all the kind of the harder edge strategy element of it, but leadership as a human quality, and leadership as a relationship, as opposed to just a skill set. And I've been working with horses in that leadership development practice for over 8 or 9 years now. I also develop facilitators, so that's part of one of the things that I do as part of the organisation I work for. So I work for a Roffey Park Management Institute, and that's what one of the things that we do is we develop developers, and particularly around facilitation. So I run a number of different programmes around that, but that's predominantly classroom or traditional facilitation of learning. I've also been around horses pretty much all my life. I think I could say pony before I could say anything else. And I still always have to crane my neck to look at any field that I've got horses in, whether I'm going past on a train or driving past them. And so they've been part of my life for as long as I can remember. And I completed my professional doctorate in April of this year. And so a professional doctorate is, you have to contribute to the body of knowledge in a particular area of practice. So I'm both a developer of facilitators and I do equine assisted development myself. So that's kind of part of what brings me to this work. There's a bit of a backstory to it as well, but that's kind of part of it, really. So I thought it would be useful just to say a little bit more about, well, what do we mean by facilitation? And it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And these were just a couple of very basic definitions that I work with. I work with some more than others. I mean, the top one is the dictionary definition of to facilitate is to make easy. And the second one, the neutral servant of the group, is kind of almost like a standard definition of what it means to facilitate. But it is about, for me, it's about supporting a group of learners to achieve the goals that they need to achieve, and whether that's really kind of short-term outcomes when it comes to learning about something, or whether it's a longer, deeper process of development. And my role as a facilitator is to support them in achieving that. So I particularly work in a leadership context, but it really doesn't, it's not specific to a leadership context. It's anybody who can support the learning and development of a group of people. That's kind of facilitation, really. There's all sorts of, I mean, the couple, the next two down, the catalyst for meaningful change. I mean, we could spend a whole hour just unpacking some of these definitions, but I suppose I wanted to try and be as inclusive as possible, because facilitation isn't just about working in an educational setting, whether that's leadership development. It really does encompass such a broad range of supportive behaviours when you're working with anybody to develop in whatever way that happens to be. I think the skills and the abilities as a facilitator are common throughout, really. So hopefully that just gives you a sense of which part of that definition, or which of those definitions you resonate with, and which ones do you feel best supports your practice as facilitators. They're all about facilitation, and as I say, it's such a broad church, it should include everybody, really. So hopefully that's just given you a bit of a sense of, well, when I'm talking about facilitation, that's kind of what I mean. And just to say a little bit more about the research, I mean, again, I could talk for an hour just on the approach that I took, but I suppose a couple of things just to highlight, so you've got a sense of how I went about doing the research, is it's very much a qualitative approach. So rather than quite a lot of research you might come across is very much what you call quantitative, which is how much or how little or how often does something happen, and does that have a link between, if you do X, will you get Y? Whereas qualitative research is much more about the lived experience, which is much more in tune and in keeping with the experience of facilitating working with horses. You can't really put very many numbers around it. It's very much a lived experience. So the method of researching it are kind of congruent with the actual experience itself. So it's a qualitative research. If anyone's interested, it was the research methodology I use was interpretive phenomenological analysis, and I'm not going to explain what that is because that will take me at least a year. But what we also did was we worked with exemplars. So it wasn't a large study, but it was very much in depth. And again, that's one of the things that makes it different from a quantitative study, is that it goes into, you don't have to have the numbers because you're not working with statistics. You're actually drawing out themes from the lived experience that people are talking about. And because my particular area is leadership development, between myself and my supervisor, we came up with some criteria for, well, what does an exemplar mean? And so we came up with three broad areas. So a minimum of 10 years experience of working in the field of equine assisted learning, because there is a school of thought that says anybody can be an expert within 5 years if you try, but actually pen to give it a sense of real quality, and in practice, all of the 7 exemplars that we worked with had a minimum of 15 years, right the way up to 30. Another criteria was predominantly leadership development as their business, as opposed to a therapeutic background with a little bit of leadership development on the side. So it was at least an 80% of their business was around leadership development. And we had a number of people who have fitted that, but with very different backgrounds. So occupational psychologists like myself, adult educators, people with a kind of coaching background, people with a learning and development background, one person with a body psychotherapy background as well as a learning and development background. So a real variety there. And there was no one school represented in particular. In fact, I don't think, apart from one, none of the exemplars, went with anybody's particular school. They actually made their own school of thought, really, in terms of how they went about developing their practice. And the final criteria was having repeat corporate clients. Because as my supervisor pointed out, you can sell anything once on novelty. So those were the kind of exemplars. So that's where we kind of whittled it down to those 7 people. And what we did was in-depth interviews with them to get a sense of how they thought about how they practiced. And so quite a cognitive approach to it, which was, you tell me how you think about this, and then we'll explore it and give examples. But because it's such an involved process when you're facilitating it, what people were finding was that they said, you know what, I can't remember what I do. It just sort of happens. So that's why we introduced the idea of a video for enhanced recall. So we'd interview them first of all, and then watch them practice, or video them practicing, and then do a second interview based on that video. And so maybe picking out 2 or 4 or 5 vignettes of 2 or 3 minutes, which were really stood out from, well, you said in the interview that you do this seems like it's a really good example of that. Talk me through it. What was happening? What were you thinking about? Just to really encourage people to get back into that experience and really unpack how they thought about it and what their practice was. And so you can imagine there was just hours and hours and hours of transcript. So there's an awful lot of data coming out of just 7 exemplars. So hopefully that gives you a sense of, whilst it wasn't a broad sample, it was an incredibly deep, a deep research process. We had predominantly UK based, but we also had one person who was based in the US as well, which did make video quite interesting. But that's one of the things that we sort of worked with in terms of them sending me videos and us working off that as well. So that's one of the things that it was a really kind of in-depth approach to the research. And I suppose what I want to kind of move on to, because I would like to do an overview and then maybe open up for questions towards the end. So what you've got there may, depending on the size of your screen, may make you go, ugh, what's all that about? But these were the things that came out of the research in terms of, they're called superordinate themes. So they're really big chunks of what was common across all 7, irrespective of their background or their approach. What were the things that came out that there was all some kind of agreement on, or the things that were seen as important in how they thought about what they did and actually what they did. So I'll go through those in a little bit more depth in a second. But what I'm trying to represent with that as well is, whilst they're seen as separate, they overlap and they link. So for example, presence and safety are really highly connected, and they feed off each other, and presence as an intervention is also part of it. So whilst I'm going to go through them separately, they're not separate, they're not discrete, and I think hopefully you'll see where some of the connections were. So the next slide just breaks that down, so just into those kind of core themes really, and I'll go through each of these in a bit more depth to give you a flavour of what was meant by each of these and how did that play out in. I'll try and give you some examples. I've got a couple of quotes from some of the participants as well, just to give you that sense of the depth and the subtlety within each of these. So these are the headlines, but there's so much underneath each one of these, and just get a sense of what is it that's most interesting for people. So the first one I'll go into in some depth, and it was really striking, the thing that came out, which probably won't be a surprise to those of you working on a regular basis with horses, but the idea of presence, and what impact presence, the presence of the facilitator has, was really prevalent throughout everything, and that seemed to be the thing that everything else hung off, and if you got the presence bit right, then lots of things came off that. So I'll kind of give you a few examples of what that meant. So as a state to operate from, it was about each participant, each exemplar, each person in the research was able to embody their own authentic presence. And what that also meant was that they were aware of their own physical sensations in the moment. So not just presence in a kind of charismatic sort of sense, but in I am present in this moment, sort of being with, being here, being now, and really in touch with what was happening in their bodies, and what that allowed them to do was connect with their intuitions. And there's a whole section I could do on when does intuition become reliable, and what are the different sorts of intuition. But what was interesting is it was the state of presence allowed those facilitators to notice, oh, there's an intuition, let me check it out. And so they were very open to what was emerging both within themselves, but also within the horse, within the participant, the learner, and what was happening in the environment. So it was very much that state to operate from. And because they were also in that state, they were very good at being able to think on their feet, essentially, but be able to reflect in action as well as on action. So they could notice their own process and go, oh, okay, that's my stuff. Or, I wonder what's happening here. And they could process all of that in the moment rather than, 2 hours later or at the end of the program, whatever it was. So they were very much working in the moment. And also the second bullet point is they were role modeling that state. So the presence, they were kind of inviting the learners into their own presence by role modeling it. And I think that, as I said earlier, that in itself is an intervention, is to support somebody to find their own present, and that sense of their own presence. And I think that's really part of it as well, in terms of it connects with a couple of other things. I think there's also something about the presence of the facilitator as being part of creating a sense of safety, and we'll come on to safety next, really, because I think that was incredibly important for everybody. If I had to order them, it would be in this order. So presence was the kind of most prevalent theme, and then safety, and safety in an emotional sense and psychological sense as well as a physical sense. And I think that's something that's kind of really important. And I think also really the state of presence to work from was a real, really supported in one of the other key themes, which is around attention and the quality of the attention in that moment. And also we talked there was a bit that came out around the downsides of being present because of that. Well, I'm so present in the moment, I'm not actually aware of what I did half an hour ago because it's gone. I was aware of it in the moment, and it's really being in that flow can actually be a downside, because how do you then support yourself and develop when you can't even remember really very much what you did? I mean, it's not quite as bold as that, but that sense of there are downsides to that being in the moment, which a couple of the participants were really kind of wrestling with them for themselves and thinking about it from the perspective of how do I support my own development, and how do I support my own presence and my own well-being. I had one of the participants talking about catnapping and saying that actually sometimes during programs she will give herself 20 minutes just to catnap, and she said, and there is literally cats involved. So there was a real sense of being aware of how challenging it can be to develop and maintain presence. So that was kind of, as I say, that's a huge one in terms of what was important to all of these, all of the exemplars. And then the next one, as I said earlier, was about safety, and it was a really interesting one because this is where I think it starts to be quite different to classroom or other sorts of experiential learning, because you have to pay attention to both physical and emotional safety, and different participants had different people in the research had different approaches to that. And I think that's one of the things to think about in terms of how do you give yourself the capacity to pay attention to the both elements of physical and emotional safety. And a couple of things that came out of that, there's a whole list there of things that you might normally think about in terms of confidentiality, being non-judgmental, creating a contract around who's got responsibility for what. And again, different people did that in different ways, but there was a sense of setting a clear boundary, but also being quite open with people about saying, well, this work can go quite deeply, so how do you want to handle that? If that's, you know, if somebody gets upset or tearful or whatever it happens to be, let's work with that. But also something that links safety with intervening is the idea of being quite structured and directive in the tasks that were set, which was about how to maintain physical safety, but then the learning from those tasks was never structured or directed. So I think there's a real tension and balances to be had in that safety. And again, one of them described it as both bounded and open. So the structure, but there's freedom within the structure, and talking about both being hospitable and challenging. So that sense of how do we help people feel safe enough to be pushed or take some risks, and that those were always personal, emotional risks rather than physical risks. So there was a real clear sense that your job as a facilitator is to keep people physically safe as well as emotionally safe. So that was really important. And I think also part of what helped people feel like the facilitator was part of that, creating that safety, was the confidence actually, and the ability just to work with whatever came up. And actually that's a couple of the examples that people were giving is, honestly, I have no clue what the horse is going to do, but I'm okay with that. It was kind of described as skiing downhill blindfold with your hands tied behind your back. because you just don't know. You've just got to work with it. And I'll kind of come back to that right at the end, because I think that's something that's really important, that part of safety is your confidence and competence as a facilitator, and to know that you can keep people safe emotionally. And again, that's a huge topic in and of itself. Then I want to talk a little bit about interventions and what do we mean. And again, each one of these could be a whole hour. So, that's a quote, particularly around how the different participants were thinking about what is the purpose of an intervention. So there was sometimes we were talking about the theory, or the theory in mind of facilitation and the theory in practice. So what do people think about and what did they actually do? And it was interesting because it was that, I mean, the quote kind of says, I've got to be really flexible as a facilitator and be able to judge or discern what can this person or this group not yet do for themselves, and how can what's the minimum I can do that will support them in this process and help them develop that ability to do it for themselves. So a real sense of a balancing act, and something quite quite finely judged, really. And again, 15, 20, 30 years of experience of working in development really enable people to do that with kind of seeming ease. It always looks easy on the outside, but there's a huge amount of kind of processing happening on that internal level. What's the right thing to do right now? So I think a couple of things that were really struck me from the research was, irrespective of anybody's background, often the clear purpose of any intervention was to keep the experience in the here and now. So that takes us back to presence and being in the present, and to keep it about the horses, and to keep it about, well, what is the horse inviting? What is it they're offering us? And keep it about that, because kind of otherwise, why have a horse if you're not focusing on that, was kind of what a lot of them would say. And often the interventions was simply to raise awareness, and so offering observations were interventions in their own right, really. And also there was quite an emphasis on encouraging the learners to use emotions as data, and observe what it was in the horse and what was it bringing up in them. So a real sense of connecting horse and person, but not on that cognitive level, but on that physical and emotional level. And this is one of the reasons why safety is so important on that emotional level, because when you connect people with their bodies, you often connect them with their emotions, because, you know, feelings, the physical sensations are often the starting point for emotions. And so quite often people would be merrily going along and going, oh yeah, I'm fine, I'm fine. And then you ask them, well, what does fine mean, and where is fine? And then they'd realise they weren't, and there was a whole other host of stuff going on, because quite frankly, a lot of learners, in my experience, do tend to treat the body like it's the thing that carries the brain around. So there was a real sense of privileging the data from the horse, but also privileging the more felt sensations as well. Also, there was a lot of intervention to support experimentation. So helping people understand, well, what would I do? What could I do differently in order to get a different experience? So it wasn't about teaching. It wasn't about helping people to get the right response from the horse. It was just, okay, what could you do differently? And let's see what difference that makes. There was also a sense of, I can help as a facilitator support sense making and transferring back to the workplace. But actually most of the participants said, do you know what, most people do that for themselves, but they're prepared to do it if somebody's just struggling to make that connection. And they were also really aware of the power dynamic between themselves as a facilitator, because they may also be a horse expert as well as a leadership development expert, and so really conscious of how do I go about intervening, and there's lots of different ways of approaching that. And also encouraging the observers and the other people who are a part of that to be active in that process, and so not all being about privileging the facilitator's voice. In fact, it was almost the opposite. I'll only add stuff in if it's not already been said. So that's, I mean, there's like huge amounts we could talk about in terms of intervention. And then this is the other really important area, which is what's the data that you're paying attention to in order to intervene and decide what it is you want to intervene in, if indeed you are going to intervene. And so one of the participants talked about what's on her radar, and that sense of there being multiple sources of data, and about being able to process multiple sources of data. And this is partly where experience and the role of intuition based on a kind of pattern recognition from experience, and how that can show up as an intuition. So there's part of that. So, I mean, we talked about horse client itself, but actually some of this was also, some people were also talking about paying attention to the environment, and also paying attention to whoever it was that wasn't with the horse. But these were the three most common across all of the research participants. So yeah, so those primary, but the primary source would be, of course, the horse, and also the ability to pay attention to internal data, so what's going on in me as the facilitator, as well as the external data, without losing that quality of presence. So this is where it's kind of like, gosh, this is tricky stuff when you're thinking about it and breaking it down like this. And part of that paying attention to the internal data was being aware of your own judgments, your own projections, your own biases, your own stuff, basically, and able to draw the client's attention to their internal data as well as the external data. So again, attention and your ability to pay attention and to draw attention in the learner is kind of part of intervention. So again, it's all connected. And there's just a little quote from one of them as well about what was that person's experience of that internal process and the physical practices of breathing, which I know, hopefully we're doing all the time, but really being aware of the breath as an anchor to attention and presence in the moment. And the questions that are kind of going around in that person's mind. So what looks like a very kind of calm, silent facilitator, there's so much happening underneath the surface, was essentially what this was talking about. So having the attentional capacity for all of that data is another reason why paying attention to your own well-being is absolutely vital, because you can't do all of this if you're not really fully well and resourced. Was something that came out, and we're talking about how you maintain your sense of your own instrumentality. How do I stay able to be present and paying attention? And then this one was fascinating. God, honestly, I could spend all night on this one as well. There were some really different philosophical positions, but what I would say is everybody had one. Everyone had a position on how they thought about learning. So it's not what they thought about learning, it was the fact that they had a particular way of approaching it that made sense to them and was backed up actually by various different schools of thought, whether that was just simply based on, actually this is what's occurred to me over the 10, 15, 20 years I've been practicing in learning and development, or whether it was based on kind of more formal approaches. And so some of the differences were things like, so am I helping this particular person or group develop particular capabilities, or am I simply raising awareness? And there was a subtle difference between, is this seen as learning, so learning about leadership, or is this seen as developing someone into whatever leader they need to be? So again, very slightly subtle differences there, but there was a sense of, well, actually my role as a facilitator is slightly different depending on what this is, and the same person could have different approaches depending on what the client required. So I think that was part of it. I think a few things that were absolutely crystal clear across everybody. There was a real common ethos of respect for the client as equal partners. So it's not privileging the facilitator's voice. It's like, I am here. This is back to, for example, the neutral servant of the group. This is not my agenda. I'm here to support you in achieving your agenda. I think there was a real strong focus on the idea of embodied learning. So it's kind of like the next step on from experiential learning. And I think this one was a really interesting one, is at what point does learning land? Because that was kind of one of the big differences. Was there was a couple of the participants in the research would say, well, I don't need to do anything as a facilitator in terms of sense making, because the learning is in the experience. And just because somebody can't put it into language doesn't mean to say they haven't learned it. Whereas the other 5 were, well, yes, that could be the case. For most learners in our experience do need a bit of help to make sense of it in a way that they can then use back in the workplace. So there was a subtle differences there, but that kind of helped to explain why some of the how much people would intervene or not was actually based around their approach to learning, or the theory in mind they had around learning. And I think also the sense of, but again, they were kind of similar with the embodied learning. There was also a real focus on, let's not stand around talking a lot. The more we can keep people experiencing things, rather than spending half a day in a classroom talking about how we're going to do what we're going to do, let's just get on and do it and work with the horses and then process it at another stage. And also there was also quite a lot of consideration as to where did this sit in a wider learning platform. So was this an experiential or an embodied part of a bigger program? Was it standalone? Was there coaching support? You know, was this at the beginning of a program, at the end of a program? So there was a real sense of, how does this learning fit within this individual's wider learning journey? So there was all sorts of those things to take into consideration. So there's a lot in there. So the last thing I kind of want to say, how am I doing on time? Oh, not too bad. Apologies for that. It's 1:45, but this was a direct quote from one of the participants saying, you know, it's really hard to come to equine assisted learning without having done facilitation first. It's a big leap to go from not doing this to doing it in that context. So, you know, the idea of it working in a classroom, but to think about, you know, all the areas that we've talked about, and to be aware of all the different dynamics and all the things that are going on in you, and all the things that are going on in the learners, and all the things that are going on in the horses. That's a lot. But I suppose what I want to say about that is, kind of don't get put off by that, I'm hoping what the research can do is say, okay, let's just pick one of those 5 broad areas and explore and experiment and say, well, if these are some of the principles that are coming out of this research, what does that look like in my practice? I'm trying to say, you know, there isn't an orthodoxy, there isn't a this is the way to do it. There's lots of ways to do it, but these are the principles that came out of that research that were common across all those exemplars. So I'm going to shut up now and see what questions people have, and you know, what would be of more interest to explore.
So I'm going to spotlight my video for a moment. Sue has a breather. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat box, and I will put them to Sue, or she can see them for herself. Whilst people are thinking or typing, Sue, something that came up for me on the intervention section was, if I understand it correctly, the role, or when we're doing that intervention thing, it's looking for that next step for that person. Is that right? Have I understood that correctly?
Well, I think it's understanding where they are in the learning, their learning process in that moment. So is it about simply raising awareness for that person? Is that where they're at next? Is it about helping them to experiment and do something different? Is it about helping them to make sense of it and do a so what? So I think it's just being aware of what stage are you at in that particular session with that learner. So yeah, it's kind of the next step, but it's it's a difficult balance to, without going too far ahead, because you want to keep it in the moment. So yeah, does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah. I think I'm going to put you back on Spotlight. I think I've taken you on Spotlight. So can you see, there's a comment there from Nikki. She said, I agree. Awareness is the first step of learning, and then each person is different with regard to how far they can take it in one experience.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things as well, in terms of, that's where I think it's really helpful having a lot of experience of working in learning and development for me personally, or having developed people over a long period of time, because you do get a feel for is this person full, and actually what's full for one person, you know, they may only be able to take a thimbleful at this moment, and actually just allowing them to get in touch with their body might be as much as they can cope with, because that's just kind of blown their mind. So it is about being really careful and compassionate about what is this person's next step. So yeah. Okay, I'm also seeing another one. Is qualification in therapy needed to practice equine assist? I'm not a therapist, so that may be, Becky, that might be something for you to answer.
I'm not like a classical therapist either, so, but I would say yes, unequivocally.
Yeah.
I think that comes back to the safety question.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, a good facilitator will know what their boundaries are of their expertise. I'm not a therapist or a counsellor, and that's part of safety, really. It's knowing where your limits are and what's appropriate in that session, because you might open up something for somebody, and even if you are capable of supporting that person to work it through, now might not be the time. So it's, how do you manage that really respectfully, but maintain that boundary?
Yeah, I've got some feedback here. Emma Taylor says, thank you so much. I've been nodding, saying yes, this all the way through.
Great. Hi, Emma.
And Olga says, thank you. This makes a lot of sense.
Good, good. There's quite a few things popping up, so I'm not sure I've got everything. What's the...
I've got Nikki here. She said, and isn't experience with facilitation a crucial part of being able to hold a sacred and safe space?
Yeah, again, that's, I suppose that's what I would say, having done this and really having shown just how deep the skill set is. I think experience in facilitation, it's almost, for me, I would say kind of don't do it to yourself, because it's pretty scary if you think, I'm not quite sure I know what I'm doing in terms of when it comes to facilitation of leaders or a group or whatever. There's so much going on for you. I'm not sure how you can be really fully present and able to do that if you haven't got at least some facilitation experience, so you've got some experience to draw on just to build your own confidence, let alone anything else. And what I would say though is, I know that that's not always possible for everybody, but really think about, how could I gain some more experience, and how could I be supported in gaining different kinds of experience, and whether that's peer supervision or just kind of co-facilitating with group, with somebody else who's working in a different context, just so that you've got a sense of, oh, I can breathe here, because I kind of know that I can handle whatever comes up, but that it does take time.
Great. Graham asks, there are a lot of organisations that would prefer to have objective evidence of the effectiveness of EAL. I do not think this is possible, but how to get additional credibility on the qualitative approach?
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting one. Yeah, I've got a conversation about what is the qualitative equivalent of validity and reliability, and absolutely credibility is part of it, and that is one of the reasons for doing this research, to actually say to people, because again, sometimes you occasionally you get people who go, oh, but we're pioneers, nobody's ever done this before, so we can do it whichever way we like because we're pioneers. And there's a bit of me kind of going, well, no, actually we're not. We're just extending a really deep body of knowledge around how do you support people to learn in an experiential way, whether it's in a leadership context or in whatever context. So I think part of this research is about saying we are standing on the shoulders of giants, to borrow that phrase, and I think that can help. And I suppose especially if you can articulate to a client that actually the method and the approach has got rigor, then it helps you to work out, well, actually, if we do something that's a quality input, and this is what quality looks like, then we've got more chance of having quality output. But that's part of the conversation, is how is this going to be evaluated, and whether that's through case studies or whatever metrics that clients want. And there is research into its effectiveness as an experiential learning methodology. So June Gunter in the US, she's published a couple of papers on experiential learning in a couple of journals. And so she has done a little bit more of that quantitative. So she'd run it over, I think she was 60 or 80 participants, and they did a survey and that kind of stuff. So it's pseudo numbers, but it's there. And actually that's all you can really say, return on investment and proof in learning and development. That's the holy grail, really.
Great. We've got a question from Dean here. Did the facilitators talk about how they set learning goals for clients?
That's an interesting one, because I think this comes back to the ethos of being an equal partner in the learners, particularly because we're talking about leadership development. They already had their learning goals. They knew exactly what they wanted to achieve whilst they were there. And so it was more about the participants the learners sharing what they wanted to get out of the session with the horses. And part of that, again, I think is contracting with the client, the sponsoring client. What is it you want to achieve here? And again, this is part of the learning ethos is, well, is this about a particular capability, or is this about raising awareness? And obviously it can be both, but I think it's just being really clear that the learners are equal partners, and we just need to be clear, are we doing a particular capability building, and that's fine, and we can structure it like this, or if it's actually about raising awareness and it's more of a developmental, you as a person, how do I support you to grow, then that's a slightly different contract. But they're both perfectly valid learning goals, but it's the facilitators aren't setting the goals essentially.
Okay, great. Annika's got a question. Said, are there common denominators about what the facilitators say, what they did wrong when things didn't work?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. So a couple of them did talk about things. The things they learned early on, I think, was part of that conversation. There weren't absolute common denominators, but it was often things like, I remember one participant in particular saying, if you wanted the learners to like the experience, then you often backed off from doing that kind of that push intervention that just challenged them or shifted their thinking, because it was like, oh, I want them to have enjoyed it and I want them to want to come back. But actually that's about you and your agenda as a facilitator, not the learner's agenda. And so again, this person was saying early on, I realized that very early on, I had to let that go, and it wasn't about that. There was also a couple of people were talking about if they've got too much going on and they are not well in themselves, and I don't mean unwell, but not absolutely really kind of present and focused on, actually I have to be able to embody this stuff myself, otherwise it just, people can smell it a mile off. And also recognizing that if they had their own stuff going on, they didn't know what the horse was reacting to, whether it was them or the learners. So it was those sorts of things. And yeah, I think the areas. Does that answer your question?
Sorry. Okay. Got another question. Graham's asking, what is your view on the requirement of pragmatic leadership experience alongside facilitation experience?
Oh, again, that's a great question. I think what was interesting is I think all of them had or were leaders in their own right. But I think, again, one of them was talking about it helps so that you can kind of connect and empathize, but you've got to be really careful that you don't start projecting your experience of leadership. It just helps to get the right language and to help them understand how might they go about applying this and to ask the right questions. So helpful, but not essential. It's just, can you understand that client? And again, interestingly, one of them described it as really loving the client. So it's not about a generic program, but really understanding before you even get anywhere near the group and the horses, what is this organizational context and what is it they're trying to achieve, and how does this fit in with all the other things that they're trying to achieve? How can I create hooks between what they as an organization are trying to achieve and what might come up with the horses?
Okay, great. I've got a question here. Does the research include time between workshops, thinking in horses and humans? For example, 4 per month, per week, per day, etc. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, kind of. Is that for the horses or for the participants, the learners?
Great question. I'm going to take that to mean for the learners.
Right. Again, it was interesting because not that many of the research participants would work with the same group or individual on multiple occasions. So they were often 1 or 2 days, but one-off, because they were part of a wider program. So, but again, it was one of the things that came up across everybody was it might take a while for the learning to land. So how can you give people processing time?
Sorry. Yeah, keep going.
And I think also just being aware of actually
per week, per day,
what is happening in people in terms of how they're processing things, and so just giving people some kind of percolation time, and whether that's overnight, a couple of days, a couple of weeks. There was no set way of approaching that, but there was a sense of people do need time. How much time is really individual and different for each group, really.
Great. And finally, I have a comment here from Emma, and she just says, I love a deep dive into these areas of your research, if at all possible. Mm-hmm. Deep gratitude for your research. So we're getting towards the end of the call. Do you have any sort of further steps that we can take? Is there, where can we learn more?
Oh, great question. So what I'm hoping to do is to put some blogs out, probably on LinkedIn first, but also when I've got my act together with a Facebook page, just to put some blogs out there on each of these 5 areas, to sort of delve into it. But also I think that's one of the things that if people are interested, and I'm not suggesting we necessarily do a series of 5 webinars, but if there's 1 or 2 areas that people would really like to go into more depth, we could do a webinar that is much more interactive and it's much more questions, because now you've got the edited highlights of the research. Then that's something that we could do if that's of interest.
So if people want to pop in the chat box, if there's one of those particular topics that stood out for them, or something that they would like to dive in deeper, then yeah, we would be happy to explore that with another couple of webinars, and really maybe to look at something where, ideally long term, this would be integrated with some horse work and actually in the field type experience. I think there's so much to explore. I don't think we ever stop learning.
No, exactly.
And it's purely a case. I love your point about taking one and just developing that in the work more, because one thing at a time, single focus, and develop that and improve that.
And also just kind of a point around, say, the idea of growth mindset is a really useful phrase in that is not yet. So I'm not good at something yet. And that's, we're all lifelong learners, really. And so how can we go about being conscious of what it is we're experimenting and building in reflection and curiosity, and maybe there's things around peer supervision that might be useful. And I don't mean supervision in that kind of formal sense, but that's somewhere to say, well, I had this experience, I'm not quite sure I handled it this way and it seemed to go okay, but can I explore what other choices might there have been? That kind of idea, really.
Great. And yes, there's lots of yeses coming in saying, yes, please, thank you very much. And can we look at these more? So yeah, let's agree to get that set up, Sue. So I'm going to wrap this up for tonight. Say a very big thank you to the EAHAE and Gerhard for sponsoring tonight's call and hosting tonight's webinar. I think it's been a success. I think lots of questions, lots of feedback and thank yous, and certainly lots to think about. So let's keep this conversation going. And if people want to get in touch with me or Sue, or Gerhard to sort of continue this conversation and continue this growth, this learning and expansion of our knowledge in the area of facilitation with horses. So we'll stay on the line for a couple more minutes just so that we've got time to read the comments, but we'll bring this webinar to a close, and thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it.